I remember the rain most of all. Not the heavy, theatrical sort that sends students running beneath the cloisters, but a thin, almost apologetic drizzle that softened the outlines of Oxford until everything looked slightly out of focus. On afternoons like that, the city feels less like a place and more like a memory, sliding backward through time. And I had the uneasy sense, even before Lewis said a word, that this case would belong to that gentler, more treacherous category of mysteries in which nothing announces itself, except a faint disturbance in the air. The porter at Lonsdale, a man whose patience suggested years spent watching academics wander past him in fogs of philosophical abstraction, told us he'd seen Dr. Martin Fenwick leave the philosophy department after what he called a rather muddled talk on Plato and moral paradox. Fenwick, in the porter's recollection, walked out with the distracted haste of someone who had somewhere important to be, yet carried none of the objects that usually accompanied his departures. The porter hesitated, then mentioned it. He left his umbrella behind. Never did that before. A small remark, easily dismissed, but it nestled itself into my mind with the quiet insistence of a half-solved clue. I've always believed that disappearances announce themselves long before anyone realizes, not through blood or spectacle, but through the tiny ruptures in routine that only someone accustomed to studying the frailties of people can fully appreciate. Fenwick's umbrella was just such a rupture. A man can forget his notes, his timetable, his dignity, but an umbrella on a day of steady English rain? That is another matter entirely. Later that afternoon, I found myself at the Randolph, seated by a window whose glass trembled each time a bus lumbered past. The bar had the smell of polished wood and tired conversations lingering in corners. I had a crossword open before me, and although I rarely confess it, the clues were defeating me in a way that felt oddly personal. The theme appeared to be absence, though the setter had disguised it beneath puns about missing letters and vanished kings. My eyes drifted again and again to a clipping folded on the table. Visiting lecturer fails to appear at scheduled dinner. Concerns raised by faculty. A small headline, but the sort that clings uncomfortably to one's thoughts. Lewis joined me with the guarded look he adopts whenever he expects I've already reached a conclusion. He asked whether the clipping troubled me. I told him it wasn't the clipping. It was the lecture I hadn't heard, the umbrella no one had claimed, the faint smell of something not quite right drifting along St. Giles. He nodded, though I doubt he understood, and we sat for a while in the companionable silence of men who spend too much of their lives noticing what others ignore. The porter's description of Fenwick's disjointed manner kept circling back. A philosopher, by all accounts, precise in speech and merciless in argumentation, wandering through a lecture on Plato as though his thoughts had become untethered. I imagined him standing before the students, speaking of moral paradoxes while fighting those private contradictions that unravel even the brightest minds. People often break quietly, not with dramatic gestures, but with sudden absences in their sentences, pauses where certainty should be, hesitations they hope no one hears. When we left the Randolph, the rain had grown steadier, drawing thin silver lines across the pavement. Oxford at dusk always feels like a city holding its breath. I found myself thinking of Fenwick striding across that same pavement the day before. Or not striding at all, perhaps sitting somewhere alone, puzzling over his own disappearance long before anyone else knew it had occurred. A taxi rolled past with its headlamps smearing light across the wet street, and for a moment I saw a figure in the reflections. Tall, coat pulled close, moving with the weary determination of someone who has lost more than he can articulate. I blinked, and the image dissolved. We returned to the college, Lewis asking whether I genuinely believed the umbrella mattered. I told him the truth as I saw it, that in Oxford, the smallest detail often drags behind it an entire history. A forgotten umbrella might be no more than forgetfulness, or it might be the first ripple of a man slipping beneath the surface of his own life. And somewhere between the Randolph and Lonsdale College, between the crossword clue about a vanished king and the porter's quiet certainty, a faint suspicion began to form. A suspicion that Martin Fenwick had not merely disappeared. He had stepped out of one world and into another, leaving behind only the delicate trace of rain on stone and a question that would not go away. I have always distrusted tidy rooms, not the natural order of a careful mind, but the sort of tidiness that announces itself too quickly, too confidently, as though someone has attempted to erase the presence of a life rather than arrange it. Fenwick's guest room at St. Mark's carried precisely that kind of chill. Even before Lewis unlocked the door, I sensed the stillness waiting behind it, a stillness that had nothing to do with peace. The room greeted us with that faint, polished smell particular to spaces that have recently been cleaned but not lived in. The bed had been made with an efficiency no academic I have ever known could muster. Sheets drawn so tight they seemed ashamed of having been slept in at all. On the small desk sat only a folded program of Fenwick's lecture, crisp at the edges, untouched by the restless fingers of a man preparing for a talk. No notes, no scribbles, no philosophical tangles bleeding into the margins. It was as though the paper had been left there by someone who wanted us to find it and find nothing more. Lewis muttered that the place looked immaculate. I told him it looked curated, which is altogether different. Curated rooms speak of intention, not comfort. Someone had made decisions here, decisions meant to guide our eyes along a narrow path, away from whatever real disorder had once sat in the corners. A half-empty bottle of wine stood on the windowsill. Cheap Merlot, the sort of thing poured by lecturers who pretend they aren't drinking on a budget. 2 fingerprints clung to the glass, like faint ghosts. One smeared. Lewis asked whether it meant Fenwick had company. I found the thought troubling not because I believed it, but because the bottle felt like theatre, a prop placed to suggest a simple, almost comforting story. A man drinking alone or drinking with the wrong companion. But the rest of the room resisted that narrative. The wine was the only sign of human hesitation in an otherwise sculpted tableau. What truly unsettled me was the scent. Subtle, elegant, nearly gone, but unmistakably feminine. Something floral with a shadow of something sharper beneath it. Not overpowering, not careless. A scent that belonged to a woman who understood restraint. It lingered most strongly near the wardrobe, which, when I opened it, revealed only 2 neatly pressed shirts and a jacket so formal it seemed improbable for a brief academic visit. I closed the door and let the perfume settle back into memory, though it clung to me longer than I expected. Lewis knelt to examine the desk. I watched his broad frame move with the caution of a man who fears disturbing what he does not yet understand. He reached behind the drawer and pulled out a small slip of paper, a library receipt dated 3 days earlier, listing a text on moral determinism. Ordinary enough, except it had been misfiled behind the drawer rather than inside it. I turned it over, expecting some accidental note, but found only a faint crease running diagonally across the corner, as if someone had folded it in haste and then decided against it. People rarely hide receipts unless they carry meaning, and meaning in this case could be found only in the book itself. I felt a small pulse of interest stir, the same quiet spark that arrives when something inconspicuous begins whispering the possibility of significance. Lewis found another scrap under the chair, a torn piece of paper, the edge rough, as though yanked from a notebook. On it, in a hurried scrawl, someone had written a line of poetry attributed to Tennyson. Except it wasn't Tennyson. The phrasing, the cadence, the faint echo of metaphysical unease. It belonged to Matthew Arnold, a poet whose melancholy would have suited Fenwick far better. I couldn't decide whether the misattribution was carelessness or message. People choose their mistakes more often than they admit. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling its unnatural firmness. Rooms tell their stories reluctantly, and this one was no different. Fenwick had prepared for something, or someone had prepared the room for him. The difference between the two is often where the truth lies. Lewis asked what I made of it all. I told him the room felt like a corridor with all doors locked, except for one that someone had tried very hard to hide behind the wallpaper. He frowned, thinking I was being poetic, which is always a mistake. Poetry is merely the shortest route to an uncomfortable truth. As we left the room, I took one last look at the wine bottle on the sill. The rain beyond the window had deepened into the steady grey curtain that so often accompanies the first real sign of trouble. The bottle remained half empty, neither an invitation nor a confession, simply a pause. And in that pause, something faintly wrong began to flicker. There are cases in which the living inconvenience me far more than the dead. Fenwick, in disappearing, had at least the dignity of silence. The three people who remained very much alive possessed none of that restraint. Yet each, in their own mannered way, revealed something of the man we were attempting to find, or to understand. I've long suspected that the truth of a person is best located in the quiet dislikes they inspire. Lewis and I began with Dr. Helen Ross, though I cannot pretend I was eager. She had a reputation at St. Mark's for brilliance sharpened to the point of discourtesy, the sort of scholar whose intellect preceded her like a draught through an old corridor. We found her in her office, surrounded by the cool, faintly metallic scent of aged books. She looked at us as though our presence interrupted a sentence she had been writing in her mind, one she resented losing. She spoke of Fenwick with the clipped enunciation of someone determined not to show her irritation. They had worked together once on a paper that caused a minor academic uproar, a quarrel over interpretation disguised beneath footnotes and classical allusions. She said Fenwick lacked discipline, that he preferred speculation to scholarship, that he had a curious way of forming conclusions before arguments. Each statement landed with a practiced neutrality that could not conceal the restrained heat beneath. When she dismissed us with a nod so economical it was almost insulting, I watched her eyes drift toward the stack of papers on her desk as if Fenwick's shadow still lurked there. Lewis murmured outside that she didn't like Fenwick much. I told him she didn't like many people much, which is often the badge of the truly gifted or the quietly wounded. But her manner bothered me less than her final gesture, a small, almost invisible wipe of her fingers against the desk, as though brushing away a trace she wished had never been left. It was nothing, of course, and yet nothing is often where the first tremors of meaning begin. From Ross, we went to Edward Merton, the bursar. His office smelled of dust and nervousness, and he greeted us with a smile stretched too thin to be sincere. A man built not for conflict, but for compromise, except when finances were involved. He talked quickly, hoping, I suspect, to escape himself. Fenwick had accused him years ago of mishandling college funds, a minor scandal that never reached the papers but clung stubbornly to Merton's conscience. He insisted the accusations were unfounded. Fenwick was always too ready to see corruption, he said, always too eager to find fault. There was something pitiful in the defensiveness of his tone, a brittleness that revealed more resentment than he intended. While he spoke, I noticed a small ledger open behind him, the ink fresh, the entries too perfect. People who lie financially tend to overcorrect. Neatness becomes an alibi. Lewis asked him when he last saw Fenwick. Merton hesitated, a subtle break in rhythm, the mind tripping over its own anxiety. Before mumbling that it had been months, perhaps longer, he folded his hands together in a gesture so tight the knuckles whitened. If guilt lay anywhere near him, it was the guilt of a man who feared humiliation more than wrongdoing. A dangerous fear in its own quiet way. But it was Clara Fenwick who lingered with me longest after we walked away. Fenwick's estranged wife lived in a small house just beyond Jericho, a place with roses attempting to thrive against the odds and windows that looked as though they preferred to observe rather than invite. She greeted us with a composure that felt neither cold nor warm, merely self-contained. A woman accustomed to disappointment and determined never to show it twice. She spoke of her husband, her voice steady, her eyes giving nothing away except an intelligence too fine to disguise. They had separated amicably, she said, though her mouth tightened slightly on that word, as though it carried splinters. She claimed they corresponded occasionally. Nothing unpleasant, nothing dramatic. Fenwick was complicated, she murmured, and I found myself wondering what truths she had elected not to utter. She mentioned, almost absently, that he had once misplaced his diary for several weeks. The remark was so soft it nearly dissolved into the air, but it struck me with unusual sharpness. No one had told her about the diary. Not yet. When we left her house, the evening light had begun to dim, settling over Oxford with that peculiar melancholy I know too well. The hour when everything seems to hesitate between memory and regret. Lewis asked which of the three I trusted least. I told him trust was a luxury and dislike a more honest currency. And Fenwick, it seemed, had accumulated just enough quiet dislike to make the edges of his disappearance far too sharp to ignore. Somewhere among them, Ross with her concealed wounds, Merton with his trembling pride, Clara with her unreadable calm. A truth waited. Not loudly, not impatiently, but with the same stillness that had haunted Fenwick's empty room. There are buildings in Oxford that refuse to admit the present, however insistently the world outside rattles at their windows. The Bodleian is one of them. Each time I step inside, I feel as though I've entered a chamber where the past is not only preserved, but quietly plotting its own return. That afternoon, as Lewis and I crossed its stone threshold, the weight of old scholarship pressed down with a solemnity I had not the energy to resist. Lewis had reached me by phone earlier, his voice carrying that subdued excitement he attempts to hide out of respect for my nerves. He said he'd found something misshelved, something that ought not to have been where it was. I walked through the reading room searching for him, noting how even the dust motes drifted with a kind of patient wisdom. Students bent over their books with the earnest ignorance of those who believe understanding is a matter of persistence alone. I almost envied them. Lewis appeared between two towering shelves, holding a philosophy volume as though it might dissolve in his hands. He said he'd noticed it because it didn't belong there. The spine slightly newer, the position uneven among older texts. He'd opened it, he confessed, out of curiosity. And curiosity, in this line of work, is often our most dangerous virtue. He handed me the book. Inside, tucked between chapters on moral agency and determinism, lay half a letter, torn at an angle so crude it seemed the work of someone who feared discovery more than they feared clumsy fingers. I recognized Fenwick's handwriting immediately. Its angular precision, the faint backward slant, the way certain letters curled inward as though reluctant to expose themselves. The paper carried a faint stain, perhaps from tea, perhaps from nerves. I read the fragments in silence. A mistake from 1979, the one truth I dared not speak at the tribunal, and then nothing more. The sentence ended in the torn white of the page, a silence louder than any confession. Lewis asked whether it meant anything. I told him everything means something. The problem is determining how long it takes for meaning to become visible. We walked the aisles without speaking for a while. There is a particular melancholy that settles on a man who has spent too many years surrounded by books he will never finish, ideas he will never master, and truths he will never fully know. The Bodleian amplifies that melancholy until the heart grows uncomfortably aware of its own limits. I stopped by a window, watching the grey light press against the leaded glass. If Fenwick had hidden the letter here, he had chosen his sanctuary well. If someone else had hidden it, their intentions were darker, more deliberate. Lewis began examining the shelf where he'd found the book, muttering that the arrangement made no sense. He pointed out that the surrounding volumes were part of an older collection, their bindings loosened by time. This one, however, carried a more recent catalogue sticker. Someone had placed it here with purpose. But why philosophy? Why moral determinism? Why a letter referencing a tribunal from nearly 2 decades earlier? I ran my finger along the shelf and felt a thin line of dust interrupted near the back edge, a faint indication that another book had recently been removed. I doubted the librarian would have noticed. Libraries, much like the human mind, reveal their absences only to those willing to search for them. The torn letter bothered me. Not its contents. That sort of cryptic confession appears with weary regularity in my line of work. But its condition. The tear was diagonal, deliberate. A person tearing in anger rips straight across. A person tearing in panic grabs at the nearest corner. But this looked like the work of someone who tore it quickly, then changed their mind halfway through, then finished the job out of necessity rather than emotion. Lewis asked what I made of 1979. I told him dates are like old wounds. They never disappear. They simply wait for someone to press them. Whatever happened that year had left a mark deep enough for Fenwick to fear its resurfacing decades later. As we left the Bodleian, I felt the faint ache I always experience after encountering an incomplete truth, the sort that hovers just beyond reach, offering a silhouette but not a face. Outside, the air smelled of stone soaked by recent rain, and the sky hung low enough to touch the tops of the Radcliffe camera. Lewis asked whether this changed our understanding of Fenwick's disappearance. I told him it didn't change anything, not yet. But it shifted the light slightly, and sometimes a shift in light is all that's needed for a shadow to reveal its true outline. And as we walked back across the cobblestones, the torn letter in my pocket felt heavier than paper ought to be, the kind of weight only the past knows how to carry. There are theories that arrive not with triumph, but with the wearier satisfaction of a puzzle completed too early, the sort of solution that seems to congratulate itself a little too readily. My suspicions concerning Edward Merton belonged to that category. They formed with suspicious elegance, every motive aligning, every financial discrepancy falling neatly into place. And I have learned, over far too many years, to mistrust anything that behaves so politely. The bursar's books, once Lewis and I examined them in earnest, revealed a pattern of small divergences. Nothing dramatic enough to summon a scandal, but persistent. Tiny sums moved from one column to another. Delays in transferring departmental funds. Adjustments logged late, sometimes weeks late, always accompanied by justifications as flimsy as mist on a cold morning. A man fearful of exposure might commit such errors with shaking hands, believing himself invisible simply because no one had yet bothered to look closely. Fenwick, with his talent for insinuation and his fondness for moral scrutiny, would have noticed. The thought came to me while I leaned over the ledger, tracing the ink with a fingertip. A mistake. From 1979, the torn letter had said. A tribunal he dared not name. Men who carry the burden of one past accusation often see accusations everywhere. I wondered whether Fenwick, haunted by memories of that old inquest, had imagined corruption where there was only clumsy bookkeeping. Or perhaps he had seen corruption precisely because he recognized it too well. Lewis asked whether I believed Merton capable of harming Fenwick. I told him capacity is rarely the issue. Fear is far more persuasive than malice. And Merton's fears seeped through every line in that ledger. Still, I felt the shape of the theories settling too comfortably, like a coat that fit perfectly before one realized it belonged to someone else. We visited Merton again. His office looked even smaller than before, as though the very air recoiled from the numbers scrawled in his books. He spoke in a rush when Lewis questioned him, insisting Fenwick had been delusional, obsessed, intent on resurrecting old accusations. I listened to his protestations, the tremor beneath them, the plea disguised as indignation. The theory tightened around him like a noose, and yet something in me resisted. Too neat, too obliging. Fenwick's disappearance deserved a better lie. When we stepped out into the quad, the rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick with reflected light. I told Lewis we should leave the matter for the evening. He looked at me, puzzled by my reluctance. But an investigation is often most dangerous when clarity appears prematurely. I would rather sit alone with my doubts than march confidently toward a conclusion that felt rehearsed. That night, I returned to my flat in North Oxford, where solitude greeted me with its usual blend of comfort and mild reproach. I opened a bottle of red wine without ceremony and let the first movement of Parsifal drift through the room. Wagner has a way of reminding a man of the questions he avoids. Questions about duty, failure, memory. Questions about whether justice ever truly satisfies those who pursue it. I drank slowly, the wine catching in its glass the faint gleam of the desk lamp. Clara Fenwick's voice lingered in my mind, repeating a remark she had delivered with deceptive softness. He always feared being forgotten. Not feared death, not feared disgrace, feared erasure. A man terrified of invisibility does not simply vanish. He leaves traces, deliberate, accidental, or both. The more I thought of Clara, the more uneasy I became. There is a kind of grief that wears the mask of composure, and a kind of guilt that speaks not through trembling hands, but through calm, measured silences. She had looked at us with the sadness of someone accustomed to disappointments long preceding this investigation. I wondered what truths she might have chosen to preserve or to bury. My glass emptied without my noticing. Outside, a faint wind brushed the window as though Oxford exhaled sympathetically. I closed my eyes and let the music swell, but even the orchestra could not drown the feeling that Merton's guilt was a convenient story, not a true one. It looked convincing. That was precisely why I distrusted it. Somewhere behind the tidy columns of the bursar's ledger, behind Clara's carefully folded grief, behind Fenwick's torn letter and misshelved book, something more fragile, more complicated, waited for us. And for the first time that evening, I felt the quiet certainty that the case had only just begun to reveal itself. There are places on the outskirts of Oxford where time seems to slow of its own accord, as though the land has decided it can no longer keep pace with the city's restless intellect. The inn sat among such fields, a modest building with uneven beams and windows that held the last of the afternoon light like aging eyes. Lewis drove us there on a road edged with hedgerows that whispered against the car, as if urging secrecy. I felt a quiet reluctance settle over me, an intuition that whatever waited inside would shift the case in ways I was not prepared to articulate. The innkeeper met us with the cautious politeness of someone accustomed to listening far more than she spoke. Her hands, folded neatly, bore faint traces of flour, as though she had abandoned her kitchen merely to satisfy our questions. When I mentioned Fenwick's name, her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She said he had stayed only a single night, but carried himself with the distracted seriousness of a man visiting some private grave. She remembered the way he kept glancing toward the door, expecting someone or fearing them. The distinction, I have found, is often a matter of posture rather than intent. She recalled, too, the arrival of a woman later that evening, not young, not particularly striking, but possessed of the kind of composure that unsettles those unused to confrontation. The innkeeper said the woman spoke to Fenwick as though she knew his failures, not the polite errors of academic life, but the deeper kind, the kind a man hides behind lectures and footnotes. I could picture the encounter in the dim-lit dining room, two former intimates or adversaries sitting opposite each other, each sentence weighed for damage. Lewis asked for the guest book, and the innkeeper handed it over with a faint reluctance. I opened it and felt that familiar shiver of curiosity, the quiet thrill of something just beginning to reveal itself. Fenwick's signature was unmistakably his, tight and angular. Beneath it lay the woman's name. Margaret Hale, the entry claimed, though not the novelist I half-jokingly imagined. It was the middle initial that caught my attention, an ornate T that looked strangely theatrical. I traced it lightly with a fingertip, uneasy without knowing why. It was Lewis who first murmured that the handwriting felt deliberate. I agreed, but my mind had already wandered back to the torn slip of verse we had found earlier, the misattributed line credited to Tennyson, despite its cadence belonging unmistakably to Arnold. That same misplaced T now stood before me, not glaring but waiting. A coincidence, perhaps. But Oxford teaches you that coincidences are merely truths that refuse to introduce themselves properly. I turned another page and noticed faint indentations beneath Hale's signature, as though the pen had paused before committing to the final letter. People who sign under false identities often hesitate at the threshold of fabrication. Their bodies remember truth even if their minds attempt to abandon it. I wondered what name she had almost written, and whether Fenwick had recognized the hesitation as clearly as I did now. We spoke with the innkeeper a little longer. She described the conversation between Fenwick and the woman as quiet, but laden with something heavy and irrevocable. No raised voices, no visible bitterness, only the tone of two people circling an old wound. She had overheard Fenwick say that some things cannot be corrected once spoken, and the woman reply that silence had always been his preferred cruelty. When we stepped outside, dusk had settled into the fields, turning the sky a pale, resigned blue. Lewis asked whether I believed the signature to be false. I told him belief was a luxury. Suspicion, however, was entirely affordable. The repeated T in the poet in the signature felt too pointed. Someone was sending a message, though whether it was meant for Fenwick or for us remained uncertain. I stood beside the car for a moment, letting the damp air brush against my collar. Clara Fenwick's remark haunted me again, the one about her husband fearing being forgotten. Perhaps the woman at the inn feared the opposite, that he would remember her too clearly. Or worse, that he had already begun to erase her from the story, just as he had erased so many details of his past. As Lewis started the engine, I held the guestbook image in my mind, the careful flourish of the T, the hesitation beneath it, the deliberate placement among strangers' names. Messages hide in the smallest gestures, and this one, disguised in a countryside ledger, felt like the first whisper of a truth waiting patiently to surface. It was Lewis who found the photograph, though he tried at first to pretend it meant nothing. I recognized the tone in his voice when he called me over. An awkward mixture of curiosity and unease, reserved for discoveries that seem at once trivial and ominously familiar. We were in one of the smaller college archives, the sort of room where the dust settles in layers thick enough to muffle the past. A single lamp cast a circle of ochre light over the table where Lewis stood, holding the photograph by its corners as though it might burn him. 3 figures stared back at us. Fenwick was unmistakable. Younger, sharper in the face, the sort of youth that carries ambition like a blade beneath the coat. Beside him stood Helen Ross, her expression already carrying that severe intelligence she now wears like armor. And between them, slightly behind, a student whose name the back of the photograph did not provide. Only the faded notation, College Summer Gathering, 1979. Lewis said he'd never seen the student before. Neither had I, yet something in the boy's posture caught my attention. A stiffness, an almost invisible sense of exclusion, as though he had been reluctant to be caught between the two minds beside him. That kind of reluctance leaves a subtle mark, the sort that resurfaces elsewhere if one pays attention. I asked Lewis to dig further into the archives, though I knew already what he would find. These kinds of students, the ones who vanish into footnotes and forgotten shelves, often carry their tragedies silently. I slipped the photograph into my coat pocket and walked out into the corridor, the stone floor creaking beneath each step like an old confession. Ross greeted me with the same clipped politeness as before, though her eyes flickered briefly toward the photograph when I entered. She must have seen the outline of it beneath my coat. Her office smelled of ink and old paper, the shelves bowed from years of unyielding study. She gestured to a chair with the barest movement of her hand, a gesture that felt more like an obligation than a welcome. I placed the photograph on her desk. She did not touch it. Instead, she studied it in silence, her gaze fixed on the unnamed student. I waited. Ross was not the kind of woman to surrender information easily. She required time to rearrange her thoughts into something she believed would hold. She said the boy's name had long been forgotten by the college, a scandal, minor in public but devastating in private. He had plagiarized a thesis, she said, the sort of intellectual betrayal that strikes harder in academic circles than most people imagine. When Fenwick discovered it, or perhaps merely suspected it, there had been a confrontation, quiet, restrained, but wounding. Days later, the boy vanished. No body, no farewell, only the lingering shame of a life interrupted before it had been allowed to begin. Ross spoke with a careful steadiness, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Something in the memory unsettled her. I asked whether Fenwick had reported the matter formally. She said he had not, or not entirely. Her tone shifted then, and she said Fenwick had never been the same afterwards, as though the incident had carved a small hollow in him that nothing ever managed to fill. I watched her face as she spoke. We are trained, in this profession, to notice the movements people attempt to suppress, the tilt of a jaw, the flicker of a blink, the twitch of a hand desperate to gesture but held still by willpower. Ross avoided my eyes when I mentioned Clara Fenwick. A small evasion, but unmistakable. She had answered every question with clinical precision until that name appeared, and then her gaze slid toward the spines of her books, her mouth tightening, into a line that suggested reluctance or memory, or both. I asked whether Clara had known the student. Ross hesitated just long enough for the silence to speak before she offered something vague. A suggestion that Clara had been at the college briefly that year, attending seminars, chatting in corridors. Her words carried the texture of truth wrapped thinly around omission. When I rose to leave, Ross asked whether I believed the past had anything to do with Fenwick's disappearance. I told her the past always has something to do with the present. The question is whether it has teeth. She almost smiled then, a weary, brittle curl of the mouth, and said the past had teeth enough for all of them. Back in the quadrangle, I paused beneath an archway, the photograph cold in my hand. The unnamed student stared out from 1979 with the haunted expression of a man already on the verge of erasure. Fenwick, younger and unburdened, seemed unaware of the shadow beside him. Lewis joined me, asking what the photograph meant. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but the boy's absence echoed too loudly, and Ross's eyes, avoiding Clara's name, echoed louder still. Sometimes the past leaves a trail so faint one must adjust the light to see it, and in that fading summer photograph I felt the first true outline of a buried truth beginning to take shape. There are moments in an investigation when all the evidence drifts toward a single person with such unnerving grace that even the seasoned among us feel the faint thrill of resolution. Clara Fenwick stood at the center of just such an arrangement, her perfume lingering in that immaculate guest room, her odd familiarity with the missing diary, her cool detachment when speaking of her estranged husband, her sorrow folded so neatly it looked almost curated. Every thread we tugged seemed to lead back to her with the gentle insistence of a story eager to conclude itself. Lewis said one afternoon that the simplest explanation might be the truest. Clara had engineered Fenwick's disappearance, hiding him perhaps, shielding him from some resurrected scandal. the torn letter, the old photograph, the tribunal of 1979. All of it could fit within a narrative of a wife trying, belatedly, to save a man from his past. It sounded plausible, respectable even. People perform the strangest acts when confronted with resurrected guilt. And yet I felt the same unease one feels upon completing a crossword too quickly. A sense that the setter has taken pity on you. A faint suspicion that the real clue is hidden beneath the one you think you've solved. I met Clara again at her house on the edge of Jericho. The roses outside were beginning to wilt, though someone, perhaps Clara, perhaps the weather, had done nothing to spare them the indignity. She invited me in with the quiet resignation of a woman accustomed to police inquiries, or perhaps accustomed to the disappointments that precede them. Her sitting room smelled faintly of lavender, the kind that clings to fabric long after it has been sprayed. She sat opposite me, hands folded, posture composed but not serene. She answered my questions with the kind of calm that can be either honesty or exhaustion. Lewis, who accompanied me, believed we were closing in on the truth. I remained unconvinced. I asked whether she still wore the perfume we had detected in Fenwick's room. She said she hadn't worn it in years. Her voice did not tremble, but she did shift ever so slightly in her chair, as though adjusting herself away from a memory rather than a discomfort. She said the scent might have lingered from a scarf she once kept in his study, though she seemed unsure whether she believed that explanation herself. We turned to Fenwick's diary, the one she had mentioned before anyone else could have told her. She dismissed it as an innocent slip of the tongue, a passing remark, nothing more. But innocence rarely arrives adorned in such tidy coincidence. While she spoke, my gaze drifted to the shelf behind her, a collection of slim volumes, philosophy, poetry, a few works of fiction whose spines had faded under uneven sunlight. One book in particular caught my eye, a collection of Victorian verse, its dust jacket torn at the corner. I had seen that same edition in Fenwick's room, tucked into the desk drawer. I wondered whether Clara had given her husband the book, or whether someone had given it to both of them. Our conversation drifted, as conversations often do when people begin protecting themselves. But the fracture I had been waiting for came unexpectedly. I asked about Fenwick's fascination with moral paradoxes, and Clara, with that calm, practiced voice, said he used to quote Tennyson at her. I waited for the rest of the sentence. She added that he liked the line about the world's unseen sorrows. Except the line she recited wasn't Tennyson's. It was Arnold's, the same mistaken attribution we had found scribbled on the scrap in Fenwick's guest room, and the same poet falsely invoked by the woman at the inn. A repeated error, a deliberate repetition. Lewis didn't catch it, but it rang in my mind like a dissonant chord. 3 people misattributing Arnold to Tennyson in the same investigation? Impossible. Coincidences don't arrive in trios unless someone is arranging them. I realized, with a heaviness I could not hide, that an unseen hand was planting these small, elegant mistakes. Not to expose a truth, but to lure us into a carefully crafted direction. A direction that pointed at Clara. Someone wanted Clara to appear guilty. I asked her whether she had ever known Helen Ross. She flinched, a small involuntary movement, before smoothing her features into stillness. That single gesture told me more than any of her words. When we left the house, Lewis remarked that Clara seemed almost relieved. I told him relief can be another form of fear. He asked what I meant. I didn't answer. The mist was settling over the street as we walked back to the car, softening the edges of the evening. I felt the investigation shifting beneath us, the way a floorboard gives just before it breaks. Clara might have been protecting Fenwick, or someone might have been protecting the illusion of her guilt. Either way, the truth had begun to glow faintly. Not enough to grasp, but enough to remind me that the path we were following was one someone had laid for us with deliberate, poetic precision. There are revelations that arrive with the violence of thunder, and others that creep in like an unwelcome draught beneath a closed door. The truth about the inn's ledger belonged, regrettably, to the latter. It didn't rush at me. It waited, as though granting me one final chance to look away. I returned to the countryside inn alone. Lewis had been called briefly to the station, and I welcomed the solitude. There are certain patterns one notices only when the world has quieted. The innkeeper recognized me at once. Her expression held the weary understanding of someone who has lived long enough near Oxford to know that secrets do not stay buried merely because someone prays they will. She handed me the guest logbook without a word. I carried it to the window where the light was strongest and flipped to the page that had captured my attention days earlier. The woman's false initial still drew my eye. That soft theatrical T as though mocked by its own flourish, but it was the name above Fenwick's that now demanded scrutiny. Someone had crossed it out with a stroke too deliberate to be accidental. The ink bled minutely into the page, suggesting the alteration had been made recently, not in 1979. I tilted the book toward the light, letting the shadows expose the indentations beneath the attempt at erasure. The letters emerged faintly, like the lingering outline of a bruise. The surname had changed, yes, but the given name remained intact beneath the stroke. A name I'd been staring at in the summer photograph found by Lewis. The vanished student, the boy who plagiarized and fled, swallowed by rumor and the slow decay of institutional memory. He had returned. Not as a ghost, not as a cautionary tale, but in flesh and reinvention. A man hiding in plain sight within the same college that had once demanded his promise. The new surname, the false initial, the mismatched handwriting styles scattered throughout our clues. It all slid into place with a precision too elegant to ignore. Someone had been signaling. Someone had been crafting a trail just vague enough to seem accidental, yet just coherent enough to compel us forward. And Fenwick, poor, earnest, morally agitated Fenwick, had followed that trail to the inn. No doubt believing he could mend something that should have remained untouched. I closed the ledger gently, as though not to disturb the trembling truth inside it. On the walk back to the car, my mind replayed every small misattribution, every literary stumble, every poetic misquotation that had littered our path. The Arnold as Tennyson confusion, the perfumed scrap, the initial in the signature. Clara was not the author of these errors. Neither was Ross. These mistakes belonged to someone trying to replicate Fenwick's eccentricities without fully understanding them. Someone who remembered him too intimately, but not accurately. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind sweeping across the fields. At the station, Lewis returned just as I reached my desk. I told him to fetch the misfiled library receipt from the evidence folder. He did so, with the bemused patience of a man accustomed to my peculiarities. I unfolded the receipt, smoothing its creases. The title of the borrowed book glared at me with belated clarity. A volume tied unmistakably to the tribunal scandal of 1979, the very ethical debate that had destroyed the vanished student and scarred Fenwick. Lewis asked whether it mattered. I told him everything mattered, but this mattered more than most things. The receipt bore a date stamp from 2 weeks earlier. Fenwick had not checked out that book. The handwriting beside the stamp, a messy, hurried attempt at cursive, matched with unsettling familiarity the signature in the inn's log. Margaret Hale, with its ornate T, a false identity used twice, and twice poorly. People reinvent themselves in Oxford more often than they care to admit. Some do it by scholarship, others by marriage, a few by abandoning who they once were. But reinvention has its limits. A man who has once fled disgrace tends to carry the weight of his old name like a second spine. I told Lewis the truth then, or the beginning of it. The vanished student had never vanished. He had returned under a new surname, perhaps even a new profession, hiding behind academia's perpetual shuffle of tutors, fellows and visiting lecturers. He had made himself ordinary and thus invisible. But Fenwick had recognized him, had confronted him, had been lured step by step, clue by clue to the inn. Lewis asked whether this meant Fenwick was alive or dead. I could not answer. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, absorbing the last of the evening with that quiet finality Oxford knows so well. I stood by the window, letting the cold seep through the glass, and wondered how long a man must hide before his old sins finally find him. The ledger, the receipt, the photograph from 1979. All of them whispered the same thing. The past had returned, and it had given itself a new name. There are truths a man approaches not with certainty, but with resignation, as though each step toward them erodes something of himself. That evening, as Lewis and I walked along the river, I felt the familiar weight of a conclusion settling upon my shoulders. Not grandly, not triumphantly, but with the slow inevitability of dusk swallowing the last of the light. The Thames was swollen from days of rain, its surface a dull grey mirror carrying the reflections of overhanging branches like broken whispers. We followed a faint path along the bank, the earth soft beneath our feet. Something in the stillness felt expectant, as though the river itself held a memory it had grown tired of keeping. I'd spent the afternoon reconstructing the sequence, piecing together the fragments we had gathered. The misquoted poetry, the obscured signature, the erased name, the misplaced diary. Each detail, once irritatingly ambiguous, now aligned with quiet precision. The vanished student from 1979, hidden for decades behind a borrowed surname, Sirs Fenwick, drawn to him by a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and the desire to close a wound too old to bleed openly. A meeting arranged at the inn. A further encounter later, at the river. When Lewis called out that he'd found something, I knew before I turned what it would be. Fenwick lay half submerged beneath an overgrown bank, his body caught in a cradle of roots and reeds as though the river had made one last attempt to return him gently. His coat was soaked through, his hand outstretched in a gesture that might have been reaching for help or merely accepting the river's pull. I stood in silence, listening to the faint slosh of water against the bank, and felt a heaviness rise in me. A heaviness not of shock, but of arrival. Lewis asked whether Fenwick had drowned. I told him no. The angle of his neck, the slackness of his jaw, the absence of struggle, all of it spoke of a cardiac collapse. Sudden, unforgiving, and entirely indifferent to whether a man wished to apologize for his past or rewrite it. We followed the second set of footprints leading away from the bank, faint, hurried, and deeply pressed into the wet earth. They led us back toward the path, and there, standing as though summoned by the weight of his own guilt, waited the man who had once been a young, frightened student in 1979. His borrowed face, the new surname, the practiced posture, the carefully assembled life, now seemed fragile, as though any strong wind might dissolve it. He looked at me with eyes that carried decades of quiet dread. When he spoke, his words arrived with the soft finality of a confession that had rehearsed itself too long. He ruined my life before it began. There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. He said Fenwick had confronted him by the river after their meeting at the inn, not to accuse him anew, but to press him toward some impossible clarity. They had argued, softly at first, then with the escalating urgency of men who realize their pasts are held together by brittle thread. And then Fenwick had clutched at his chest, stumbled and fallen toward the bank. He said he had tried to help. I believed him. But panic is a treacherous companion. Instead of calling for assistance, he had made a single catastrophic decision: to hide Fenwick's body and scatter clues like breadcrumbs, pointing toward Ross, Merton, Clara. Anyone but himself, Anyone who could bear the weight of suspicion more easily than he could bear the return of disgrace. He admitted to planting the scrap of poetry, the misfiled receipt, the signatures. He said each deliberate hint was meant to confuse us long enough for him to disappear again, but guilt has a way of catching up to those who have spent their lives fleeing it. And as he stood there, shoulders slumped beneath the fading light, I realized he had grown tired of running. Lewis asked whether I wanted to take the man in straight away. I told him we would. But I felt no triumph in it. On the walk back, I felt the case settling into that familiar place where justice and pity intersect without quite touching. Fenwick had been a difficult man, proud, morally rigid, unforgiving. And yet his end had been quiet, almost gentle, claimed not by violence but by the frailty of his own heart. The confession echoed in my mind. He ruined my life before it began. Perhaps it was true. Or perhaps it was only the story a frightened young man had told himself for 40 years to survive the memory of his own failings. I looked once more at the river, darkening under the evening sky, and felt the old ache return. The ache of a world in which no truth arrives untarnished, and no ending grants the solace one hopes for. And so we walked on, the river behind us, the confession ahead of us, and my heart caught somewhere uncomfortably in between. There are nights in this city when silence feels less like an absence of sound and more like an old companion who has let himself in without knocking. That night, after the river and the confession and the weary business of paperwork, I returned to my flat with the particular heaviness that settles only when a case has ended without truly concluding. Lewis had gone home, carrying with him the kind of fatigue that fades with rest. Mine would not. Oxford lay quiet beyond my window, its spires softened by mist, its streets emptied as though the city itself had withdrawn into contemplation. It always struck me that Oxford sleeps with one eye open, dreaming perhaps, but aware that the past is forever pacing in the next room. I sat at my desk, the crossword from the first day of the investigation lying exactly where I had left it. A few clues solved? A few left untouched, defying me with the smugness only a good crossword can manage. My pen had stopped beside the clue that had bothered me most. Absence. I had, in my characteristic obstinacy, tried to force solutions upon it. Words that fit the grid but not the heart of the clue. Emptiness, vanishing, departure, all technically correct, all emotionally false. I studied it again. The setter had been kinder than I deserved. The answer had not been absence at all. It had been loss. A truth so simple I wondered whether the clue had mocked me or forgiven me. I poured myself a glass of wine, a modest red, unambitious but adequate for an evening that required something gentle. The liquid caught the lamplight and glowed briefly, as though the glass remembered hands far steadier than mine. I took a slow sip, letting the familiar warmth move along my throat. Mozart drifted through the room, the slow movement from the piano concerto I'd played too often in recent years. There was something in the phrasing, the way the melody unfolded as if apologizing for its own beauty, that made the evening feel more fragile than it already was. Music has a way of illuminating the corners one prefers to leave in shadow. Fenwick's body had been removed from the river with as much dignity as the moment allowed. The student, no longer a student, no longer quite anything except a man hollowed by 4 decades of guilt, had given his statement with the gentleness of someone who knew there was nothing left to defend. And yet, even as each piece settled into the official narrative, the shape of the truth remained uneasy. Fenwick had not been murdered, and yet he had been killed if one counts the slow erosion of conscience as a weapon. The student had not wished him dead, and yet he had left him alone by the river, afraid, collapsing beneath the weight of his own certainties. Clara had loved him once. Ross had respected him once. Merton had feared him always, and Fenwick, in his stubborn pursuit of moral precision, had failed to see the quiet devastation he carried with him from one life to another. I wondered, not for the first time, whether people disappear long before their bodies do, whether the first vanishing is always internal, a retreat from the parts of life that ask too much of us, whether Fenwick had been leaving the world in thin increments long before the river claimed the final portion. I closed the crossword. The unsolved clues felt irrelevant now, or perhaps too relevant. The wine softened the room, blurring its edges into something resembling peace. I leaned back, listening to the concerto's final chords, each one lingering just a moment longer than expected, as though reluctant to let go. Lewis would arrive tomorrow with questions. Strange would want paperwork. The college would request discretion, but for now, only the city watched, breathing its old, indifferent breath. I stood and switched off the lamp. Darkness settled around me with surprising ease. Outside, Oxford slept, or pretended to. The river moved on, the spires waited for morning, and somewhere in the quiet, the memory of Martin Fenwick already began its slow fading. I turned off the light, and Oxford continued, quietly forgetting another man who never wanted to be remembered.